Imagine a world where the most sacred books of a religion were not yet considered holy. Picture a time when the words of the founder of that religion, Jesus Christ, were not enshrined in a sacred text, but were instead shared through oral traditions and informal writings. This might seem bizarre, even heretical, to modern Christians. But it was a reality in the early days of Christianity. The journey of the New Testament from a collection of diverse, informal writings to a revered and authoritative part of the Bible is a story of transformation, conflict, and gradual acceptance. This video explores this fascinating journey, shedding light on how the early Christian community perceived and treated the writings that would eventually become the New Testament. In the first century, the Christian community was a small, persecuted sect within the broader Jewish world. The primary source of religious authority was the Jewish scriptures, which Christians referred to as the Old Testament. These texts were written on scrolls and were considered sacred, authoritative, and immutable. The early Christian writings, on the other hand, were far more informal and were often recorded on codices, a form of book that was not yet widely used. These codices contained the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and other early Christian texts, which were initially seen as practical, instructional materials rather than sacred scripture. The distinction between the Old Testament and the early Christian writings was clear. The Jewish scriptures were revered and cited with the formula, "as it is written," indicating their divine authority. In contrast, the early Christian writings were read and shared, but were not yet regarded as having the same status. For example, Justin Martyr, a second-century Christian apologist, referred to the Gospels as memoirs of the apostles and read them alongside the prophets. But he did not equate them with the Old Testament in terms of authority. This informal status of the early Christian writings does not mean they lacked importance. On the contrary, they were highly valued for their content, particularly the teachings and sayings of Jesus. The authority of these writings derived from their author, Jesus, rather than from the form in which they were recorded. Early Christian writers often quoted sayings of Jesus that were not found in the Gospels, known as agrapha, with the same authority as those that were. This suggests that the early Christian community was more concerned with the authenticity of the content than with the form of the text. The transformation of these writings into Scripture began gradually. By the time of Origen in the 3rd century, the New Testament writings were being treated with the same reverence as the Old Testament. Origen wrote commentaries on both the Gospels and the Old Testament books, indicating that he considered them equally authoritative. This shift in perception was not immediate, but was a process that occurred over several generations. The early Christian community's focus on the content and the figure of Jesus gradually led to the recognition of the writings as sacred. One of the key factors in this transformation was the need for a unified and authoritative collection of texts. As the Christian community grew and spread, there was a growing need for a common set of beliefs and practices. The codification of the New Testament writings into a canonical collection helped to provide this unity. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and subsequent councils played a crucial role in defining the canon of the New Testament. which solidified its status as scripture. The use of the codex, a form of book that was more portable and easier to use than scrolls, also played a significant role in the transformation. The codex allowed for better organization and accessibility of the texts, making it easier for Christians to read and study them. This practical advantage may have contributed to the increasing respect and authority accorded to the New Testament writings. However, the transformation was not without controversy. The early Christian community struggled with the question of how to reconcile the new revelation of Jesus with the older traditions of Judaism. The relationship between the Old and New Testaments was complex and often contentious. Some early Christians, like Marcion, rejected the Old Testament entirely, while others, like Irenaeus, emphasized the continuity between the two. This tension between the Old and the New was a central issue in the early church and influenced the way the New Testament was perceived and accepted. Despite these challenges, the New Testament gradually gained acceptance as Scripture. By the 4th century, the two-part Christian Bible, consisting of the Old and New Testaments, was firmly established. This development marked a significant departure from the earliest Christian perceptions. The early Christian community saw the writings about Jesus as more important than the Old Testament in terms of content, but they did not yet consider them to be Scripture. Over time, this perception changed, and the New Testament came to be regarded as equal in authority to the Old Testament. In conclusion, the journey of the New Testament from informal writings to sacred Scripture is a testament to the dynamic and evolving nature of the early Christian community. The transformation was driven by a combination of practical needs, theological reflections, and the growing importance of the figure of Jesus. Today, the New Testament stands alongside the Old Testament as a central part of the Christian Bible. But its journey to this status is a fascinating and complex story of change and adaptation.